things seem to be working, which is great. I'm assuming that you're going to continue interacting in all of those things and don't necessarily need to keep up with a chat room.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool. All right, I've got some beautiful slides for you
Yay.
as a starting point for our nice little discussion on UI sounds. So I guess the first question is just to, I mean, you all know what these things are, so I'm just gonna start off with some general ideas that might be useful to think of um, when talking about the kind of different aspects of these sounds. So this is something that I used in a previous thing as well, but I think it is a nice starting point, and it's kind of specific to sound in games. Although I mean, there's always a lot of overlap between what sound does in film and what it does in games. The differences are kind of obvious. Um, so this is from a book that I've linked in the last slide if you want to have a look at it. But I like the things that they kind of highlighted here um, in terms of what makes good sound design. And I'm not sure that all of them are particularly relevant to UI sound, especially the first one. Sound has to be exciting, right? And it needs to be larger than life, especially if you want to kind of immerse the listener into a scene. And of course, there are situations where a more realistic approach could be good. But for the most part, there's a lot of excitement that gets added to sound in order to really make it useful. Um, Now, I'm not sure that all user interactions should be accompanied by larger than life sounds. But yeah, I mean, it could still be relevant. And then, of course, there's some kind of harmony with the visuals. And I think in the case of user interface sounds, that's not always the case because sometimes the purpose of a user interface sound is to indicate something that is not clearly visible. If you just think about clicking on a button, there might be a little animation that goes along with it once you've clicked it to indicate some kind of successful action. But most of the time, having a little bit of a confirmation on the sound side is very useful and reassuring. So, in that way, there is some kind of harmony, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily do the same thing. And then, of course, it needs to be stylistically appropriate. Um, and I think with UI sounds, that's sometimes a little bit difficult to get right because they don't necessarily live in the same world that the rest of the sounds do. So um, the style of the sound is quite often determined by the combination of things and the things inside the world and the type of world. But if the UI is a kind of element that exists on top and over it, then it's not necessarily true that it draws from the same kind of um, metaphors or style or whatever. But still, there needs to be some kind of stylistic consistency between what you see and what you hear. If you're yeah, we can get into examples later. It needs to be clear about its meaning and unambiguous, and this is especially true for UI sound. um, I mean, I think the main purpose of UI sounds are probably to communicate some kind of thing, and it needs to be super clear about what it means. And we can talk a little bit later about the types of ways. We're going to look at two different ways in which you can add meaning to a sound like that. And then, of course, it needs to provide information, and you need to avoid silence. I think this is more true for when you're building a world out of sound. even if there is silence in the world, there needs to be some kind of sound that signifies it, which is quite a strange idea. But what it really means is that, um, there is no such thing as silence, and even a small little hiss in the background kind of signifies a quiet place or silence. But if there was no sound at all, the user or the player would assume that something is broken. And of course, if there's some kind of interaction and you've already established that certain actions will be confirmed by certain sounds, and all of a sudden there's an action that doesn't have a sound, then the assumption is also that it is broken. So it's about the completeness of the experience, really. You can't be selective about which elements you choose to underscore with sound. Um, there needs to be some kind of logic to why you wouldn't do it with certain interactions, and the safest bet is really to avoid any kind of silence or non-interaction. And then when it comes to implementing these sounds, modularity is quite important. Um, it's not a linear kind of medium, so we need to make sure that when we do the effort of selecting or creating these sounds, that we keep them modular, so that when it comes to the implementation, we can still change certain aspects about it. Kind of makes our sound design process a little bit more parametric. In other words, you can break down a sound into different parts and reassemble them once it comes to the implementation, so that you still have control over the little elements in case you wanted to change a certain aspect of it. And this comes to the last point, where by doing that, you can also then avoid repetition. And by repetition, I mean repeating the exact same sound. So that's often something that we want to avoid. And I think in UI sounds, it's a little bit less true, but still, if there is a particular sound that is going to be heard quite often, we do want to keep them modular, so that we can change little aspects of them to make them sound less repetitive, a little bit more organic, like when you're talking about footsteps or gunshots, they all sound similar, but each one is slightly different. So yeah, I think keeping these things in mind, regardless of which part of the sound you're busy designing, is always a good idea. Okay, so let's talk about UI sounds. Um, their purpose is probably to inform, unless you have other ideas of what their purpose is. Um, but then the question is, where do they exist? Are they diegetic, or are they non-diegetic? I don't even know if those terms are. I mean, they are kind of appropriate when it comes to games. But where do UI sounds exist? That's a question for you uh, at home.
Man.
Well, um,
Oh, it was a question. I thought. Yes, they
sorry,
are
I
used,
should.
and
Where do
they're non-diegetic.
are
Right.
they?
Well, because the NPC or the little character controlling isn't aware of the little, the little boop boop of the menu, unless I'm
Surely,
misunderstanding it.
surely, yes. I think you're understanding it correctly. But that
Okay,
doesn't
cool.
mean we don't get UI sounds in the world, as either, because there could be like a little thing there,
Yeah,
like a little
you're right.
computer, like a little,
Yeah.
or a button of a lift, or
Or
Mm.
Kratos
some kind
opening
of.
a chest, for loot.
Fallout,
Yes.
with he
Yeah.
has the menu on his wrist on
Yeah.
like his little Game Boy looking wristwatch thing.
Yeah, the
And
Mm,
Paperboy.
then that makes sound. So the character would be aware of those.
yeah,
I guess it depends on
it
what
does
style.
depend. Yeah. But the point is, they could exist everywhere. But we need to make a distinction of where they kind of exist, because that will influence little things. It will probably influence how they are stylized, but it will mostly influence how they are spatialized. So usually Like with other non-diegetic elements like music, we want to keep those things two-dimensional. So the UI would be the same. It just means that the orientation of the player is not going to affect where the sound is coming from. It can still be spatial, but the spatiality or the localization, the placement of the sound in the world is not going to depend on the orientation of the viewer or the player or the listener. But in the case of the diegetic UI sounds, it can. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about. I mean, I'm not 100% sure if we could call these design languages, but different approaches to thinking about the meaning of sounds. And I mean, we're specifically talking about UI sounds, but this could be anything. So I think there are generally two different approaches, and they, you can call it concrete and abstract. You can use different words to explain that as well. And I think in the design of UI sounds, it's not that it has to belong to only one of these categories. It could be like a range between these two where your sound will fall. But typically, in terms of how we get meaning from a sound, it is either because of its concrete kind of real life association, or it is something abstract that we have to learn at the end of the day. So concrete sounds would refer to real life things that you've recorded. So when we listen back to that sound, there will be an immediate association that we make with it. So this can then be extended into kind of metaphors where a real life association can be made, but it is referring to some kind of greater kind of scheme almost. And then skeuomorphism is kind of a different word of explaining what these sounds are, something that mimics or fully represents a real life thing that is brought into a different kind of realm or mode almost. So I'll give you examples of these. And then on the abstract side, we can think of things like music. Now, of course, if we listen to music, we can always make real life associations. If you listen to someone playing a piano, you can imagine someone playing a piano. But that's not always how you listen to it. Sometimes you're listening to the kind of music. You're not listening to the person playing the instrument, if that makes sense. And the musical part of it is kind of abstract because it doesn't have a real life kind of association apart from the instrument that is making the sound. But the way in which the notes are organized and the phrases are organized and the whole structure of the music is brought together is based on abstract kind of rules that we have all, of course, learned and that we are fairly familiar with. But it's not as if it's a completely, concrete real life thing. It's more on a theoretical thing. It's we learn to make certain associations with certain sounds. So we can borrow from this. It's not that we need to make music when we make UI, but we can borrow a lot of information from the musical kind of language when we talk about abstract sound design. So one of it will be consonance versus dissonance. We can also think of different pitches or different phrases doing certain things and how that can be applied to sound. But essentially, these abstract sounds are learned relationships. So it's something that we need to get familiar with first. And I think a lot of the sounds that we deal with on a daily basis are like this. If you think about these notification sounds that we're hearing in the Discord, it's not as if it's really referencing any real life sound. It's really just abstract tones being played, but the way in which they are played and repeated, and the context in which that happens is where we get the meaning from. But it does require some familiarity with the environment. Okay, so yes, let's see what this example is. So I don't know if you've seen this before. And at this point, I will need to do a sound check just to make sure that everything is getting through to you. But this is something I've only encountered a short while ago, which is kind of the material design, kind of, I don't know what they call it, if it's rules or if it's kind of whatever you want to call it. It's some ideas about sound, if you are trying to follow this design scheme or whatever you like to call it. So I'm just going to play these examples. Did that go through?
No.
No.
No, it did.
I couldn't.
I heard it.
You heard it?
Yeah, I heard it. Make sure your sound mark your stream sound volume. I
Yeah,
said maybe higher.
It's all the way up.
Oh.
But I mean, that's right. Let me not disturb you guys.
No, I think mine is at 100. You need to go to 111. Okay. So I hope everyone heard it. So that's just an example of a skeuomorphic sound kind of mimicking the sound of a lock. So there's a real world kind of representation of an action, and it's fairly easy to understand what the sound means. And then an abstract sound would just be something like that. And of course, they give us this little icon of a locking, which then gets us to make the association between this abstract sound and the lock action. But if I only played you this sound, it wouldn't necessarily make you think, okay, something is being locked now. But there's a certain kind of recognizability of this sound, and there's a certain kind of representation to a real world action happening that makes it quite easy to understand. So that's kind of the purpose of skeuomorphic sounds, is so that these relationships are immediate. It's not something that you have to learn. Okay, so let's talk more about concrete sounds. So already mentioned most of these things, but real life associations don't require new meaning to be understood because it's already there. And of course, to a certain degree, even those associations need to be learned, but so it's kind of dependent on the types of things that you would typically be surrounded by, so cultural dependent. But if it's simple things like a door opening and closing and a locking and unlocking, those are fairly common things. Okay, so metaphorical relationships already exist, which means that if you can kind of look at these sounds then as a group. Another way of putting this would be to think of the typical environment in which these sounds would be heard. So a common but very old example of this would be the desktop metaphor, right? Which was kind of the metaphor on which, the computer interface was first built, like the desktop environment that we are still somewhat using. But initially, it was perhaps a little bit difficult for everyone to understand exactly how computers work. So having a metaphor for it made things a little bit easier. So the idea of a desktop kind of represents an office environment, and within that environment, you will get a number of things, like, for instance, a trash can. So removing files from your computer it could then be accompanied by a sound or a thing, an object, which is the trash can. And likewise a sound. And then, things like files and moving them around and stacking them on top of each other, those are all ideas that are borrowed from this metaphor. So if you think about real life associations, you can extend it to a kind of wider metaphor for certain things. So the types of sounds that you would hear in that environment. So, doors opening and closing versus locks unlocking and drawers being pulled open and so on. Those are all things that could exist in the same environment, and therefore there's already kind of this relationship between them. There's already this context. So that's another benefit of using concrete kind of sound, is because if you make that reference, then you can have a look at all the different things that could potentially exist in that world that you're referencing, to make it more cohesive for the listener or the viewer or the player. Okay. Okay, yes, and this is just a repetition of all of those things, so don't need to acquire these meanings. It's easy to understand, but it could also be a stylistic choice. I think if I think of skeuomorphic design, I always think of the notepad. I think that's probably one of the Anyway, I think of the notepad that used to be like, it had like a leather texture. I'm talking about the one on Mac, which most of you are probably not familiar with. Other things that borrow from these ideas are the plugins that we typically use in audio. Let me see if I have one. Is my sound still there? Okay, cool. Sometimes if I switch between applications, my sound disappears. Let's see. I mean, wasn't planning on showing you this, but I might as well. There's a very good chance that I don't have a very great example, but maybe let's search for. Okay, no. I'm just thinking about audio plugins because that's typically also where people use skeuomorphic designs. Most of these interfaces are pretty ugly, actually. Anyway, if I don't find one, it's fine. But the idea of mimicking kind of knobs and buttons and little lights, and some people even go so far as to add little dust particles on the faceplate of the this one is going to require a license of the interface. And there's a lot of criticism for these kinds of things, but at the end of the day, it does make it a little bit easier to understand. But at the same time, it could totally be a stylistic choice. Okay, and then the other thing about these things is they can be abstracted. So it doesn't need to represent real life things 100%. You can, for instance, think of a knob, and you don't literally have to have it reflect light and, accumulate dust and all of those things, but you could simply just turn it into something that is like a slider, but just radial instead of linear. So it still borrows from that language, but it's not entirely 100% referential. So the same is true for sounds. Okay, here are some questions for you. Let's listen to some sounds. Sure. Okay. Okay, and here are the questions. What are these sounds? What was that? what does it represent? What other sounds could work with this sound?
Play it again.
Okay.
Sounds high tech, but like elegant in a way. Like kind of a successful future, a happy future.
A successful future.
Not a non-dystopian future.
Really? Any other ideas? I
I'd say
mean,
almost, sorry.
what?
I would say it almost sounds like coins or almost like keys, like it's high pitch. So
Yes.
It
Yeah,
needs to
so
be something
there's
non-diegetic.
there's a definite brightness to it, which maybe contributes to those things you mentioned there. Okay. Let's do another one. Let's do another one. Well, that was nice. I must say, when listening to these things now, if you actually don't know what they are, it might be quite difficult to figure out what they are. But that is the nature of sound, isn't it? What sound was that?
it's a little bit soft.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't
I'm
know
not
how.
sure. Is it at my side only or is it everyone?
My volume is full.
Oh wait, I just boosted my stream.
I don't know if I can boost myself and just put my mic a little bit lower. Let me see if I can do that. My input volume on Discord is also super full, so I'm not sure if there's anything else I can do. Okay, let's. Did you hear that?
It's like we only get the. Oh wait, is your noise suppression on in Discord?
No, I don't think so. I think I switched it off.
Okay, because it's
I'll
like
just
only when
double
there's
check.
audio inputs do we actually hear the other sound.
Hmm.
I think it's like a bandwidth saving feature of Discord if there's no sound.
No, if
then
it
it's not gonna
doesn't
stream
reach
it.
a certain threshold. Yeah, I'm not sure what to do because here's my thing. I switched this off and my threshold is all the way down.
Okay.
Let me just play the sound and see what happens on this meter as well. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's as if it doesn't pick it up all the time. So maybe I should just speak while while the sounds are playing. But that's not nice.
Wouldn't streaming the window help?
Yeah.
Or just like actually stream the audio from the window itself?
It could, yeah, but I'll have to switch later when I switch programs. But let's try that. Let's try that instead.
Yeah, I think for the sake of this like exercise, it would be beneficial.
Yeah, totally. Okay, and you need to do that now. Okay. Okay.
Ah, now we can hear it.
Hear that? Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a zip.
Yeah.
It's yeah. And what does it represent?
Well, opening, closing things.
Yeah, totally. What's this one again?
Paper.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's paper, but it's paper doing like a paging kind of thing, you know. So again, it could represent some moving through options or pages or whatever, and that's not something that we need to figure out. It just comes with the sound. It kind of evokes that particular thing. What was this last one? Okay. And that one?
I would almost say like a lock that's opening or actually closing. I'm not sure. It's like a sliding lock. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also thinking about the sound. Like, how do we know if it's opening or closing? I mean, we don't know because we can't really see. But it sounds for me like the first one is open and the second one is closed. But that might just be me. That
I
might just
think
be me.
I'm hearing the same thing.
Really?
It's open and then it's closed.
Mm.
Okay, but now I need to hear the
Yeah, and I
first
think.
sound again because I don't know what we didn't hear it properly.
Oh. Yeah, I can play both of them. Let's play this one again. So that was like typing
Okay.
sound. This one was the zip. And this one was the bright. I'm gonna tell you what it is. What was it? Telephone sound.
Oh, you see,
I wish I
didn't hear
I
that
could
at
hear what
all.
you heard.
Yeah.
That would have been. I'm so curious now.
It was just so soft. You can't really tell what it was.
I was hearing like a high-tech digital sound.
Really.
I mean, like if one of us streamed our Discord application, Lawrence could hear what we hear. Technically,
Well, I guess
it'd
it
be
has
like a
been
bit of
recorded.
Inception.
Yeah. No, I totally had a contact session yesterday with someone, and the sound also bombed out. And I was meant to listen to this thing critically, and I couldn't really tell which of it was part of the piece, and what was kind of added by the streaming service. It was a very strange moment.
And to think I said it was keys or something like that.
Well, I mean, I get why you're saying that. I'm not. I mean, if you heard it properly, um, you know, you would definitely be able to tell. But I'm also interested in you know the similarities, like keys, right? It's the same thing. It's metal objects scratching against each other, and so is the telephone. You know, it's just a different kind of rhythm to it, but it has similar qualities. So I'm assuming some of the qualities of the sound actually got through, but not all of them. Okay. Oh yes, here's a fun one. Well, it's fun because it's silly, I guess. So abstract sounds, meaning is learned over time, like with music. It's I don't know if all of you think about music in that way, but it is something that we learn to like and learn to understand, even if we're not interested in the theoretical aspects of it, but just for the enjoyment. It is something that evolves and keeps on changing and accumulating over time and so on. But they can also become stereotypes, which I'll play you an example of just now. Then I already mentioned that there's some kind of musical language that we can borrow from, but at the same time, we can borrow from real life when creating these sounds or thinking about the types of sound that we want to use. So here's a beautiful example of something that is totally abstract, in my mind at least. Maybe you have different opinions, but I'm sure you don't. But if you do, please share. So what on earth is happening while we're hearing these sounds?
Dial up.
Hacking.
Hmm?
Hacking.
Well,
They're hacking the government.
Yes, or my mouse. I think I'm pretty convinced that someone has been hacking my mouse, but I'm pretty sure that it's not really possible. No, anyway, so yeah, someone's being hacked in quite a significant way when we hear these sounds, because that's obviously the sounds that computers make, right? My computer just sounds like a fan. But maybe yours sounds like this. So every time we see a computer, it seems to produce the sound if when someone is being hacked. And it always reminds me of this scene that I've. Was like a little scene in Criminal Minds. That I used to watch a while some time ago, but there's this lady. She's a hacker, and I'm pretty sure her computers also make these sounds. But every time that she started hacking, it was like this vigorous typing sound that I would hear. And it's like a very loud typing. It almost sounded like a typewriter. And then on one occasion, they wanted to zoom in on her hands doing all of this vigorous typing to show us that she's really doing all of this. And then it was one of those roll up silicon keyboards, those floppy ones, but still the sound was like a machine gun almost, this typewriter thing, while all of these bleeps and bloops were going. It was just hilarious. Because that's what we expect, right? We expect those, if someone's really going for it on the keyboard, we want to hear it. And likewise, if something serious is happening and there's a lot of computation happening, we want to hear these sounds. But this is not a reference to any real life situation. At least I've never had any computers making these sounds. So it's totally abstract, and it doesn't have meaning beyond what we've learned. So it has become a stereotype, and we all can recognize this as something. So there's that kind of aspect to borrow from as well. It's not that abstract sounds don't have any meaning in and of themselves, because they do accumulate meaning if they're used over and over and over again. Other examples would be doors creaking, floorboards creaking. If you watch a film with those types of sounds in it, something bad is going to happen. It's there's extra meaning that gets attached to sounds, and that's where the stereotype idea comes in. Okay, stop now. Thank you. Okay, so other ways in which we can think of abstract sounds, apart from accumulating meaning, and also thinking about a musical language that might be useful to think of when making these sounds. They can also borrow from concrete sounds. So here we can think of the shape of the sound. Now, what I mean by shape is and this one, let me see if you can hear these sounds. But yeah, we'll get there shortly. By the shape, I mean like how short the sound is, or how long the sound is. Is it a smooth sound, or is it a kind of does the sound have very defined edges almost? So this is also called envelope in sound language. So yeah, a smooth or a rounded shape has a less final and more of a transitional kind of feel, while something that is, very sharp and short is a little bit more final. And again, you need to think about real life situations, like a door closing very slowly versus a door slamming. Those two things have very different meanings. And even though we don't need to use a door sound, those shapes still carry some of that meaning with them. You know, like a very sharp, abrupt sound is more kind of final, while something that, you know, fades in and out very slowly and subtly doesn't have that same effect. So turning of a page versus slamming down a book or putting down a book. So all of these shapes can then be applied to our abstract sounds. So just to give you some other examples of the shape of a sound, can you hear these? Did you hear that?
I think only through your microphone.
Oh. Seems we have the same problem again. Okay. Well,
You
if
just
I
move
knew this,
windows from in Discord.
yeah. How do I do that quickly? Change
Yeah,
windows.
just change
Okay,
windows.
great. Here we go. Going live. Okay. I can't even see the window that you're seeing. Okay. Can you hear this?
Yes.
Nice. And I'm the sound person. I'm so sorry. Okay, so this is a marimba. It's kind of a short sound, you know. Of course, it has this reverb kind of lingering, but that's the shortness. And then something like a cello has quite a different shape to it. You know, the sound takes a while to build up and then it takes a while to go away. It's not as abrupt. So that's what I mean by shapes of sound. Those kinds of things.
I love that marimba. So nice. Peaceful.
It's a nice marimba. It's actually from this plugin from Spitfire Audio, in case anyone is interested. It's the BBC Symphonic Orchestra. And they've got many different versions of this plugin. They've got a very expensive one, which is like $500 or $1,000 or something. But then they have this version. If you email them and tell them you want it, within 14 days, they'll send you this version for free. It's just a smaller version. But you have to wait 14 days, but it's worth it because it's like the entire orchestra, which is really cool. And it's beautifully recorded stuff. Anyway, that's what you were hearing. Okay, I'm just going to go back to the slides momentarily.
Sorry to bother. I just wanted to ask, is that plugin available for Reaper specifically?
Any DAW.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think I'm sharing these things again. My eyesight. Yes, I'm sharing. Yes. Okay. No, thanks. You see, there's the mouse hacking. It's busy going crazy. Okay. Cool. So that's what I mean by shapes. Now, another kind of musical aspect that we can think of when talking about UI sounds is the concept of consonance and dissonance. Now, I'll play you some examples of what that means, but this lady also has some thoughts on it.
Psychoacoustics, I hope you'll remember this word, is founded on the basic observation that the human auditory system and other species' auditory systems exhibit tonotopicity. Tonotopicity is a frequency to place mapping in the cochlea. That means that a given frequency is going to have a sweet spot on the basilar membrane where that particular frequency reaches the height of its activity as a traveling wave is carried down the basilar membrane. The hair cell that is sitting at that particular sweet spot, let's go ahead and call it 1K, the hair cell that's at the 1K spot is going to be the hair cell that will be most sensitive to 1 kilohertz. It's going to be activated to other frequencies. If its little neighbor over there is most sensitive to 1.1K, the 1K hair cell is going to have some activity going on, but his neighbor is going to have more activity. This tonotopicity helps explain theories of pitch perception. It also helps explain the origin of consonance and dissonance. Musical consonance and dissonance, also called cognitive consonance and dissonance, is based on tonal music systems, and it's based on theory. Small integer ratio dyads, meaning 2 simultaneous frequencies, whose relationship can be described by small integers, such as a 1-to-2 ratio, a 2-to-3 ratio, a 3-to-4 ratio, and I just described the octave, the perfect fifth, the perfect fourth. Those small integer ratio dyads, 2 simultaneous tones, are regarded by most listeners to be kind of harmonious and kind of pleasant. In Western tonal music theory, they would be called consonant. But consonance and dissonance also have a sensory origin. When 2 frequencies are very closely spaced, we say that it's impossible to resolve those 2 frequency components, meaning that you cannot hear them apart. If we were to play simultaneously 1000 hertz plus 1004 hertz, the resulting wave would look like this. There'd be 2 fine components, 1000 hertz and 1004 hertz. We cannot hear those apart because our auditory system can't resolve those components. Think of it like 2 colors that are so closely spaced, it's very difficult to see them apart. But what's of interest to us in psychoacoustics is their difference product. The difference product is 4 hertz. They're separated by 4 hertz. So this wave is going to have, on its temporal envelope, it's going to have an amplitude modulation at around 4 hertz. And we're going to perceive, we can't hear 4 hertz, it's below perception, but we're going to perceive a wah, 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 this beating tone. It explains why minor seconds, major seconds, and some minor thirds are considered more dissonant than consonant because of that byproduct, that beating. Beating goes up to about 15 hertz or 20 hertz or so, depending on which researcher's work you're reading. The higher frequencies, from about 20 hertz to about 150 or 200 hertz, are also perceptible, but they're harder to perceive, and they are called roughness. Roughness components helps to explain why a tritone was once called the devil's chord, diabolus in musica. It's the devil. It's the devil in part because it's difficult to sing, as I understand, but also because the math that explains the frequency ratio relationship between the 2 tones that together form a tritone dyad is described in a just tuning system by the numbers 32 and 45. Unlike a nice octave, a 1-to-2 ratio, the 32 to 45 ratio is describing 2 tones, complex tones, let's say, that have partials, harmonic overtones, that are rather closely separated. And what that gives rise to is a very slight but obvious sensation of roughness, the really fast amplitude modulations. You can think of it in another modality, the modality of touch. An octave would be running your fingers across silk. Minor second would be running your fingers across corduroy, really thick corduroy where you can feel the bumps, bum, 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 bum. Roughness would be like running your fingers across denim. Denim, jeans, is obviously rougher than silk, harder to detect on your fingertips. So think of the tritone like jeans, the octave like silk, minor second like corduroy. I hope that helps rather than confuses. But the basic principle of this auditory filtering, the fact that when 2 frequencies are closely separated within a certain bandwidth, they will interact with one another, is the dominant theory that helps explain psychoacoustics. So please remember the words tonotopicity, auditory filtering, critical band.
To remember those terms for our kind of, endeavors. But I mean, what she's saying is essentially, or at least the part that I find interesting, is that this idea of consonance and dissonance is obviously something that is a big part of how music works, and even though music is something that we learn about, it lives in that abstract realm. There's also something in the ear that makes us perceive things as consonant or dissonant. So the way in which the cochlea works and the little kind of hairs that sense the different frequencies, if they're very close together, it is dissonant. So there's a kind of physical or physiological explanation as well in terms of how we perceive these things as consonant and dissonant. But I'll play you some examples of what these sounds sound like. So I guess we can start with just listening to some musical sounds and then thinking about how we can identify or translate them into something that is not necessarily music, but just a simple UI sound or something. So I think I'm going to play you my examples first, and then we can have a look at these material examples as well. Okay, so I'm going to have to switch windows again. I'll play you the Devil's Chord first, okay, in case you're curious about that one. Okay, here we're back in Reaper. I'm going to stick with the marimba. Do you want to hear the Devil's Chord?
Yeah.
That's it. Played on a marimba. So that's the tritone. It's about the relationships between two different notes that she's talking about. And some of them sound a little bit more clashing, like this one, for instance. That's the Jaws sound. Psycho sound, whatever. There seems to be a clash there, whereas that sounds very whole and kind of complete. So that's dissonant, more consonant. That's the devil, so it's dissonant. And we get more or less kind of dissonant and consonant sounds as well. But, in terms of what they mean, if you hear a sound like this, or maybe if that was a user interface sound, what would it tell you?
Wrong.
Yeah, it's wrong. There's something wrong about it. It's like something happened. It's not a good outcome. And it's because of that dissonance, so we typically associate dissonance with, some kind of negative outcome or some kind of tension. In music, it creates tension. And what you actually want in music is for that tension to be resolved. And I think it's the same with user interface sounds on the abstract level. And then there's basic kind of tonalities like the major sound. It's just because of the combination of notes, but that's kind of like an open, friendly, brighter kind of sound versus slightly darker, so major and minor typically gets associated on surface level with happy versus sad. And all sounds have this kind of tonality. Not all, but a lot of sounds have this built-in kind of tonality of, something that sounds a little bit darker versus brighter versus open versus closed. So those are the things that we're kind of looking for. And then the type of thing that we can also draw from music is the direction in which a sound goes. And I'm not talking about spatial direction here. I'm talking about if you have notes, does it go from low to high or from high to low? So something like versus brings me back to that lock sound, you know. The reason why I think we could hear the first one was open and the other one was closed is because there's a little bit of a directionality in terms of the sound goes up versus the sound goes down. So this is, I mean, I don't want to tell you what these sounds represent. You should tell me. If you heard this sound and then this sound, what would they mean? What could they mean?
Can you play it again? Completing a level, maybe?
Which one?
Oh. I would say the second one.
Yeah, so the one goes up, it leaves us kind of up there. There's an openness to it because it ends on a high note, you know? And the other one goes down, it leaves us on a low note, which is a little bit more grounded. So we tend to think of that sound as a little bit more complete or final in a way. Another one would be like verses, you know, so the up versus down. It's like an announcement about to be made, and that's the announcement now over. Now, I'm not saying this is true for everyone because you might have different opinions and feelings about what those things imply, but there's a general sense that ascending versus descending has a certain feel to it. So I want to take you to these material examples as well. There we go. Are you seeing these keypads?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. Let me just go to the tonality example. Okay, so the idea with this sound is it's those that similar thing I just played you, and there's really no dissonance to it. There's no clash. It feels quite happy, open, light, bright, and it ends on this high kind of tone. While this one feels a little bit more open and not unambiguous. It feels a little bit more ambiguous. So I can play more of my examples of those if that would help. But yeah, that's the first example. Then in common. Okay. Here and here they talk about the upward motion, openness, positivity. And the downward motion kind of indicates ending, as you've pointed out, or some kind of closedness. And then something that repeats is kind of stuck in the middle. So it's kind of going up and down, but it's kind of repeating itself. So it indicates some kind of process. It doesn't yet feel as concluded as, you know, the first and second example. Okay, let's listen to these ones as well. So of course, I think having the visual representation there makes it quite easy to understand, but those two sounds do have something in common. It's just the direction of the sound kind of changes, and it also ends on quite, it's not clashing, it's not dissonant, it's not like that first cluster of marimba sounds I played you. So the problem that they have with this second example is that it seems that the second sound doesn't really live in the same kind of tonality as the first one. So it would have been better to repeat the same kind of tones, but just in reverse order, than having new tones that are seemingly unrelated. So I think if we think about the types of sounds that we choose, if there's a certain action that has two kind of options, either something that is selected or unselected or whatever, but it relates to the same, I don't know, property or aspect or whatever, then those two sounds must be close enough together. Otherwise, it creates some kind of disconnect between the two interactions that you can have with that particular parameter. Let's see what these ones are. Yeah, so it's another example, just a bit more simplified. Okay, cool. So what this one does nicely, like the first one, it goes up to open, down to close. This one goes up to open, and then even more up to close. So the idea of switching between an off and an on state is countered by the sound that accompanies it, because the sound keeps on going in one direction instead of flip-flopping between the two options. There's a contrast between what's happening and what we're actually hearing. So yeah. Do you have any thoughts about these things? Should I play you more dissonant notes, consonant and dissonant notes on the marimba? Let me play you one more while we're here. Okay, I'm back on Reaper. So yeah, I played you these kinds of sounds, these kinds of sounds, those kinds of sounds, all very kind of dissonant. But then there are more subtle things like so, a sound like this, if you play this one first, and then sorry, I should stop making mistakes because I'm going to confuse you. I'm not very good at playing keys, it seems. So if I leave you on this note, how's that going to make you feel? Is it going to make you feel good or bad? Versus if I leave you on. So if I'm going to play these in a cycle. If I leave you there, it's gonna feel a little bit unresolved, potentially. Because it feels like this thing needs to go here again. So there are certain sounds that if you leave people with those sounds, it feels unresolved, like this. And this feels a little bit more resolved. or does it? You also have ears and opinions, so if you feel it doesn't, please tell me. If it doesn't make any sense at all, please also tell me.
Makes sense.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so those are musical examples of consonance and dissonance, and they can be present in sound effects as well, of any kind of abstract nature. Okay, so when thinking about making sounds, let me just see. Okay, yeah. There are a couple of things that we need to take into consideration, and most likely a lot more than I've got here. These are just some initial thoughts. We need to think about human hearing a little bit. We need to think about contrast. So these sounds, I mean, if you think about your phone, right? Your phone has notification sounds, but these notification sounds have to compete with the environment that you're in. And you might be in a very nice, calm, quiet environment right now, but maybe later, I don't know. I mean, our environments are very different these days, but maybe later on you're going to be in a more noisy environment because you do construction work or something. And then these notification sounds need to compete with that environment as well. So typically they should have a little bit of they should be in a little bit of contrast to the environment. Now in a game, of course, we're not really talking about the physical player's natural environment, although we could. But we're talking about the sounds in the game, you know, all of the ambiances, all of the sound effects that are occurring, and then, of course, the music as well. And if these sounds for UI are too similar to any of those environmental sounds, then we're going to struggle to really hear them. So yeah, we need to think of how we can contrast them and how we can also then blend them. So that it's kind of a balance between those things. Then we need to be aware of the platform as well. And this really goes for all sound. But if you're creating mobile games, for instance, it's quite different from creating games that are played on computers where people will most likely be wearing headphones and those kinds of things. So yeah, we can have a look at that as well. And then another thing that I feel is very important with UI sounds is they need to be concise. They need to get out of the way as soon as they can. We can't have them linger because they're already competing for space with all of the other sounds happening at the same time. So they should do their job, which is to communicate some kind of idea or, you know, outcome, and then they should get out of the way. We should always try to make them as short, and it's not necessarily short, but concise, you know. Sometimes we might require a longer sound, but it shouldn't be like a piece of music that starts playing every time you make a selection in the menu or something. Okay, so talking about human hearing, we have a fairly, well, I guess we don't have a very wide, we have a particular kind of range. In comparison with cats and dogs, we have a fairly limited range, but our range roughly goes from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And these curves, this is called the Fletcher-Manson curve. What it is essentially telling us is that our hearing is not linear, it's not flat. So we hear, and this graph is almost upside down, but not really. What this is telling us that we are more sensitive to sounds in this range. So where the curve goes lower, we're more sensitive to sounds in that range. And less sensitive to sounds in this range and that range. So this would be like super low bass frequencies. And this would be, you know, most of us can't even hear those things in any way by the time we're 18 because our hearing slowly deteriorates. This range, however, is maybe not coincidentally, but, you know, it is where consonants are formed. If you analyze the voice in terms of its frequency content, it depends on who's speaking. We all have different pitches and stuff, higher voices, deeper voices, all kinds of voices, but consonants are mostly formed in this area. And consonants are also very important to hear. If you remove the consonants from words, then you can't understand what's being said anymore. But you can still remove some of the vowels and have a little bit of an idea of what's being said. The other thing that's quite interesting is that infants, babies, very young babies, scream in this range. So that's where their screams kind of sit in the frequency range. And our ears are most sensitive to that frequency range. So there's a lot of theories behind why our ears work like this. But it's quite convenient for an infant that our ears are sensitive to its screaming, because then we can, yes, because then we can save it from, whatever trouble it's trying to get into. So yeah, we need to take this in consideration. A lot of the notification sounds and informative sounds can happen here, but that's also where it can interfere with things like dialogue. And that's one of the reasons why we need to keep it short and concise. But if our sounds kind of live in this area, it's probably going to be more audible, because we're just more sensitive to that. And here is an example of the frequency response of a phone, and any like a nice phone, not headphones plugged into a phone, just like a small speaker on a device. It means that most of this stuff over here is unusable, and most of the things above that is also unusable. So it's a fairly narrow range in terms of our frequency range that we can actually use. But luckily, again, our most sensitive and the most critical part of our hearing kind of falls within this. I don't know if it's convenient or if it's by design. It's probably kind of both, because those low frequencies cannot really be produced by anything as small as a cell phone in any way, because it's physically impossible. Okay, but these are kind of limitations. So I mean, I know we're not making sounds for phone notifications, but it's the same principles that apply. And sometimes we do play games on mobile platforms. Okay. It seems like I've been going on for quite some time. Are you all okay? Still.
Oh yeah.
Should tell me if when I should leave. Okay. Okay, so UI sounds should also work hierarchical almost. There should be sounds that are prioritized, and it's based on how important the actions are that you are taking as a player, and also in relation to the audio environment. And we've already spoken about what that could mean. All the ambiances, sound effects, dialogue, music. Which of these sounds of the UI might be less or more important than any of those things? And then how can you kind of communicate that importance? And it comes down to how loud they are, but also, if they're not concise, then they're going to seem like they're more important. Another way of looking at it is looking at the frequency content of a sound. So sharp versus dull sounds. So let me take you to another example of this. Here they are. Okay, so password typing in sound. I mean, I don't know how they prioritize different things, but it's not an extremely, it doesn't have to be announced in a big kind of way. If we do something like that, it is something that, let's just listen to the sounds. Okay, so it's not an extremely high priority sound. A high priority sound might be the phone ringing, you know, because that's the ultimate purpose of the phone, I guess. Or is it? Um, and also because the sounds are repeating, it doesn't have to be super bright or very invasive. So it's a quiet, kind of softer sound. So the frequency content has a lot to do with how we interpret the importance of a sound. So if we listen to a contrasting example, this would be it. So there's nothing inherently wrong about this in my mind, but it's quite different. It grabs your attention. It demands more attention. It demands to be in the foreground a little bit more than the other one. And it's just because the second version is a lot brighter, more piercing, more higher frequencies than the first one. Which do you prefer?
The first one feels far more tactile, like you actually hitting the screen. I would assume when you're touching the screen and you're getting that sound feedback, that would feel more satisfying to me.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way. No, that's an interesting thought. Because the balliness and the sharpness of this is a little bit more removed from the action of actually typing things on a screen. So yeah, it has that going for it as well. Cool. Okay, let's do some examples if you want to. So I just want to show you a couple of things. I mean, it's a difficult thing. Like, where I don't want to jump ahead, but where do we get sounds? That's always a difficult thing. Well, you pay lots and lots of money to a sound designer to make you some sounds, or you become the sound designer. No, it's a difficult thing, but you know, the easiest place to start is just to get as many free sounds as you can. You know, and the GDC has released, I think, for 6 years now already, every year at the time of the conference, or maybe just after it, they release a free audio bundle full of things. And it's usually samples from bigger libraries, but the ones that are in there you can use for free. It's just not like a full collection, but it's like 20 gigs of sounds per library, and they've done it for 6 years now. So if you download one of them, it's never going to be enough. But if you continue to add to your library, that's where it becomes really useful. Instead of going out and searching for things as you need them, you kind of build up your own personal library. So my recommendation is always to start with those and see what you're still missing, and then you know, you just add to them and so on. Now, another thing that I find very useful once you have these things is to have a program that helps you to find the things that you're looking for, because that's the second challenge.
It's one of those.
So I mean, there's no good answer to it really, but the answer that is typically avoided is metadata. Now, if you use your Windows Explorer or your Mac Finder and you search for interface and UI, these sounds, for instance, are sounds that you're not going to be able to find, because that description of user UI and interface is hidden from the operating system. It's not part of the file name. It's not part of the directory. It's not part of anything that's visible. It is hidden inside of the sound itself. So there's metadata at the beginning of the sound file that is only read by certain programs. And that's usually where people put useful information. Sometimes they put nothing in there, but sometimes they do put useful information in there. So if I searched for menu, for instance, I wouldn't be able to find these. But now that I'm using this little thing, this program, I'm able to find it. So you can search for more things, and you will be able to find more relevant things if you use a program like this. So what I'm using here is called MetaDigger, and it's a free program for Windows and for Mac. There are links in the sheet that I'll share with you. I install this on the drive with my sound effects. So wherever I am with my hard drive full of sound effects, I always have this little program. You only scan your files once, and then it goes and it collects all the metadata from these files. And that's where it becomes a little bit more easy to search for stuff. So, I mean, if I searched for UI and interface by the file name, you can see how many of these I would have actually gotten. Not many of them.
We're not seeing
You
that
know?
window.
Oh, damn. Okay. Does make a difference if you can see the window. So I'm going to show it to you. Okay. Yeah, I thought I would just jump ahead. You know, so these are examples of sounds in my library that are all mostly from those GDC bundles. I still have like 2 years of them that I need to download, the most recent ones. But yeah, I was showing just like this program shows you the file names, but it also shows you this description, and the description part is the part that is most of the time is hidden away from your kind of built-in search function on your computer. So it's a simple little program, but then I can search for UI interface, for instance. And you can see these are the file names. So if I did this same exact same search using Finder or Windows Explorer, I wouldn't have found these sounds, for example. They wouldn't have come up. And it's just because you cannot include all of the information of the sound in the file name, because that also makes it less useful. So typically the file name is just some short kind of idea about what the sound is. The more useful information is usually hidden in the description. So you can see here that people sometimes add a lot of information over there. And it's only through programs like MetaDigger that these become searchable. And that's why I recommend it. I never search for sounds using Finder. This is such a lightweight, easy to use little program that there's really no excuse for me not to use this. So yeah, I mean, if you look at this list, you'll see how many of these sounds would have been lost if I searched for UI interface by file name, you know, because not a lot of them have that information in it. I mean, it would have been great if we could search metadata via our Finder, or Explorer, whatever you use, but we can't. So we use little programs like these. If you're more serious about the sound design thing and you want to, you know, it's something that you do all the time, there are also DAWs that can search for these things, and you can add more metadata and so on. But for most people, this program is really all you need. Makes it easier. Anyway, so I found some sounds, and I thought let's have a listen to them and think about them a little bit together. So I'm going to switch windows again. Okay, back to good old Reaper. And if you're looking for a program in which to edit sound, I would recommend Reaper. It's kind of free, which is kind of nice. If you're looking for something entirely free, then you have to look for something else. But yeah, I would totally recommend this. There's a lot of cool things that you can do beyond just simple editing with it when it comes to game sound. But I mean, we're just interested in editing and exporting and those kinds of things. So even if you're not going to go full on into making sounds and those kinds of things, I would recommend that you learn some basic functionality of these things. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these sounds, and I just want to get your thoughts on what they might be used for, and what's nice about them, and what's maybe not so nice about them. Just as a way for us to talk about these sounds together. So let's do a sound check.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. Nice. How about that one? I always like that sound, but it's quite a heavy sound. It's quite a firm, kind of weighty sound. So it's not something that we can repeat over and over again. It feels like something that has, it represents some kind of conclusion of sorts.
Like a prompt to delete or remove something.
Maybe,
I'm gonna say the first one was sounded like an alarm, like if you were
It-
inside a ship or in a big suit. Like, oh, get out quickly. That's what it sounds
yeah.
like
It's like ambient spaceship sounds.
as well. Yeah.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, and we can see like little lights flashing and
And Tom's
signals.
eyebrows raising.
Yeah. That one's quite similar to the first one.
It's like a dot matrix printer. Ooh, that's Love, Death, and Robots.
Hmm.
Definitely.
So coming back to the idea of a shape of a sound, you can see like this one fades in gradually and fades out gradually as well. So it's a very different sound from something like this. It's almost as if it could be like a transitional sound as well, like switching between different options.
Yeah.
I should have had visual examples, but I thought, hey, this is about sound, so maybe. No. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are tons of things here. A lot of them are just like combinations of stuff. I think this one was just someone connected modules in a synthesizer together and just let it run, and then they sold this thing as a UI sound. So sometimes you'll have to harvest little bits and recreate some stuff out of it as well. This one's very bleepy and bloopy.
Like they've taken a dial-up tone and modified it.
It does sound like dial-up, especially that part. Okay, like this one, for instance, is a great example of something that is kind of, it's that idea of the direction of a sound. It ends at the top instead of going down. So it's quite an abstract sound. It's not quite musical, but we can identify that kind of shape in it. That's quite musical. And this one, apart from the fact that it is quite dull, it is a little bit of a darker sound.
It's mysterious.
Because it's mysterious and it lives in this kind of lower frequency range
it's
as
like
well.
Discovery in Age of Empires.
Hmm. No, anyway. yeah, we can piece some of these things together in order to achieve specific things. But let me just show you what I mean by the kind of frequency range that you need to consider, and also thinking about limitations of the playback system as well. So if you use an equalizer, for instance, which just allows us to, in case you don't know, it allows us to take out or emphasize certain frequencies of a sound. And this area then here would be that portion that the Fletcher-Manson curve showed us to be more sensitive. And these are the parts that then would go missing in the case. I don't know if you can see this window actually.
No.
Oh. Okay, well, I'm not gonna share this window because, gosh, yeah, maybe I should share this window. Okay, but I'm okay. Let me just share this window briefly so that you can see what I'm talking about. It's literally the same program, just a different window that I now need to share separately. Okay, so this is the EQ. I think you can see it now. So it shows us the frequency content of a sound, and then we can decide to take away some of it. So according to those graphs, this would be the unusable range, and that would be the unusable range when, dealing with smaller kind of systems. But then coincidentally, or luckily rather, the critical range where our ears are most sensitive is kind of around there as well. But let's just listen to some of these sounds through this filter then to see how they differ. So I'm just going to take you back. Well, actually, let me leave it here so that you can see how the sounds look. But I'm assuming you're not hearing it anymore. Maybe not. You guys still there?
Yeah.
Did you hear the sounds?
Yeah.
Yeah, tweet,
Cool.
I guess.
Yeah, you never know with this window sharing business. Okay, so that sound was the one that was so kind of deep. So if I bypass this, that's how it used to sound. But the usable range of this sound when in that specific situation would be a lot more limiting. So the idea is, if we want to have these sounds, and I mean, it's not just when you're limited to small speakers or whatever, but you need to remember that the rest of the frequency range is going to be filled up with other things, quite possibly, like music and all of those things. So when we look for UI sounds, we kind of need to look for sounds that have a prominent kind of presence within this range. So generally, the brighter, the better. If we don't want them to be bright, we can always make them duller. But if they're bright to begin with, we know that they're already kind of living in the correct frequency range. So yeah, I mean, if we just look at some of these sounds, I wanted to piece some of them together. Just put the other window back and see what we could do with them. Because I think what will extend your use of a limited sound library is if you can make some changes to the sound that makes them a little bit more appropriate for your use. So if we listen to some of these sounds, maybe these. I mean, they might be nice, but they might be a little bit abrasive. if that's a problem, it's as simple as just removing some high frequency content from them. So I'm not going to show you the window again, but I'm just going to reapply that filter that I showed you before coming back to this window so that you can hear how it sounds with the filter on. So this is without it, and this is with it. I'm just going to push up the volume as well. Okay, that's maybe a bit harsh. But you can totally change the character of a sound. So taking it from this to this to something like that. Let's maybe pick a different sound. So that's quite a nice, subtle, softish sound. But without the filter, it's got all of these high frequency things in it as well. You know, and we won't typically do this to like other sounds, because as soon as we start filtering sounds, they become a little bit unrealistic. But these things are already, you know, abstract, and we can really transform them into something a bit more appropriate quite easily by just filtering things out that we don't want. Okay. Now I've got some other ones that I've extracted from here as well to make some combinations. Let me just find them. So here, I extracted a couple of bits from it. So this sound, and I thought maybe let me add a little bit of a clickiness to it as well. So with that. Okay, and sometimes it's cool to combine them as well, because then you get more use out of them too. And then of course you can go and filter some of the sharpness out of the click if you want to, for instance. And this is how the separate components would then sound. Okay. And of course, you can then think about the balance between them. So not having that big kind of body at the end, having it a little bit softer, makes the sound much less invasive. But if you didn't have the little click there, it might get lost in between all of the other sounds as well. So while I'm speaking, you can't really, you might not even notice that there's a sound happening. So having these different components is useful for that as well. You know, in the case where you can afford to have some body to the sound, it's there. But in case there's a lot of other elements that will compete with it, there's also the other more sharp, bright kind of element that can make up for that and kind of cut through. The other reason why I like having them separate is when it becomes time to put these sounds into a game, you know, whether you're doing it directly in the engine or using something like Fmod, it gives you more options to work with these sounds. So another thing that we spoke about at the beginning was the idea to keep sounds kind of modular and to avoid repetition too much. So if you have these two things separate, you can then import them separately and treat them differently. So I'm going to show you an example of that as well. Let me just show you another one that I've extracted before we go there. It's a little bit louder now, but so these are some things that I've extracted, and yeah, let me just filter some of those highs out. Anyway, okay, so again, these consist of two different elements essentially. So I'm just going to have a look at where I saved these files. So I exported these as separate stuff. So this one as separate and this one as separate, and the other example as well. Just two separate files with the aim of them putting them back together. Now, I think most of you have done the Fmod stuff with me in any way. And if you haven't, I mean, it's easy principles that can probably be applied directly in the engine as well. So yeah, it's not 100% critical that we go into detail about that aspect, but I just want to show you this. Okay, so I already have the sounds here. So I think with UI sounds, the variability doesn't have to be that big. You know, it's not like footsteps or gunshots. We want them to be fairly similar. Otherwise, they might give us an indication that it's now signaling something else, you know. So we don't want to build too much variability into them. It needs to be super subtle. So I've got some examples here. So let me just create an example. So here I've got those exact same sounds that we just heard, but as one exported audio file. Okay, can you hear that? I hope so. There it is. So of course, something simple that we can do with sounds to give them a little bit more variation is to just randomize aspects of them. Now again, with these kinds of sounds, we don't want to go overboard. So we can, you know, randomize the pitch a little. And by little, I mean like a little. Not a lot. Because if as soon as you go too high, and even that's too high, maybe that's not too high. Maybe we can get away with it. I guess it depends on context as well, doesn't it? You know, and we can do the same with the volume so that every time it is triggered, it's at a slightly different volume. But at some point, you know, if that variation is too big, the viewer, player, listener, user, whatever you want to call them, is going to assume that the change that they've just witnessed carries some kind of meaning with it, you know? And that's not what we want. We want it to just make, you know, we don't want the attention to be pulled towards the sound. And that's one of the reasons why we want variability, so that it sounds and feels more organic. But if it becomes too much, it becomes an important feature of the sound. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. But if you have the two separate components, it makes it a little bit easier to get variations out of it. So let's just first see the first example. Then we're going to do the second example as well. Okay, so this is the little click. The sun is coming in. Can you believe it? Okay. So same sound. But what we could, for instance, do is instead of varying the entire thing, we can now just vary the click. So let's see how that sounds. We're in very subtle kind of territory here. It's not gonna. So that's quite nice because the body of the sound remains the same. We're quite sure that it's the same thing, but on a kind of subconscious level, people are not going to get tired of the sound because there's a little bit of variation in it. So again, we're not doing this for the entertainment of the player. We're not trying to entertain them necessarily with our UI sounds, maybe a little bit, but it's for the you know, we are very sensitive to patterns and repetition and those things when it comes to sound. So we're trying to avoid it, to have this sound repeat in exactly the same way. So it's more for those purposes that we're doing it like this. Let's just So another example would be the other sound. So just to remind you how it sounds. Oh no, it's this one. Cool. So another subtle variation would be to take the start of the sound, take the body of the sound. So the one thing that we do need is we need the start to be kind of firm and precise with this particular sound. So it's it's something being clicked on. It's a selection being made. But what we can do to create interest in this case is, again, maybe some pitch variation on the longer body part of the sound. And maybe that's already too much because it's quite a pitched sound in any way. But what we could do then is, for instance, make the sound a little bit longer or shorter so that it's not always the same. But at the same time, there's still one part of the sound that remains consistent. I think that's important with UI sounds. It's better to do it as separate things rather than the whole sound. Otherwise, there's too much variation. We need something to stay consistent. So I'm just going to randomize this offset time, which essentially just plays it. It randomizes where the file is being played from. So this will result in longer and shorter variations of this particular sound, but it will still start playing at this point in time, which is great. So maybe, again, that's a bit too much. So we might tame this a little bit. So it just adds a little bit of organicness to it without really changing the core of the sound, which I think is nice. So that comes back to that idea of keeping things modular. And it's not that much effort. And, we've already kind of gotten two sounds to work together for other purposes, for the sake of getting more out of the limited amount of sounds that we might have access to, So it's simple ideas to kind of maximize the use of these sounds. Anyway, I would like to ask you if you have any questions or things or ideas that you would like to discuss or anything, because I think I've gone through my examples now. Let me just go and double check.
I've never thought about doing sound that way. That's very cool. Got so many ideas now.
Well, that's nice to hear. Yeah. No, I mean these are fairly if we spend some time thinking about sounds, there's a lot that we can identify of these ideas, and there's surely other directions in which we can also go. But it's useful to sometimes just have a little bit of a framework that can help you to decide which sounds might be more appropriate. So what I would recommend, I know it's not entirely the same thing that you guys are doing, but go through those material design sound principles. They're not extremely intense and stuff, but I like the simplicity of it, and I think it can very easily be applied to most UI sound. So I've shown you some examples. There are links for all of these things in the slides, which I can share with you somewhere, along with some links to the software that I've mentioned and so on. And then there was also a podcast that I wanted to share with you on UI sound for your own entertainment, but I didn't find the link in time. So I'll find that and I'll just post it here on the Discord server somewhere
Awesome.
once I found it. Cool.
Jonathan, what's wrong with your mic?
I'm eating.
Nice.
Lawrence is
I don't-
looking at the chat there.
I'm not looking at the chat. Let me look at the chat.
I don't necessarily have a question, but I usually make the music. I pretty much make all the sound assets for my games usually. So I usually try to take care of what kind of theme I use and what kind of vibe I would bring to a game. So I suppose what advice I suppose do you have for a person that's generating their own music compared to searching for them online per se? For UI in this case, because we're talking about UI here.
Hmm. So you're more interested in creating your own things.
Yes, yes.
Well, I mean, the same principles would apply. I think if you're trying to create your own things, what I've seen a lot of people do is just create, set up some weird process. It doesn't really matter, like a couple of strange effects or something, like a chorus or a pitch shifter or something. Um, and if you have a mic, that's obviously quite nice. And then you can just record random things like crumbling up paper or throwing things around, things that you're allowed to throw and not at people, but just objects, and then process it and record all of that until you have like a lot of material, and then you extract little bits from it, small snippets, without really having an aim. You just do that, and then you go and look for things that might be cool. So that will help for getting more abstract sounds, instead of designing the whole thing from scratch, which can be quite difficult, especially for short sounds. I would recommend
Yeah.
just creating a large kind of thing where you just you get some sound that you record, something that makes noise or whatever, and process it with strange plugins like pitch shifters, record the result, and then extract little bits and pieces that you want. And I mean, this can be the same for a lot of effects, sound effects. If you think about the shape of a sound, like a short marimba sound or something,
Yeah.
you can take any sound and apply that shape to it, by cutting it that size and then just having a little bit of a fade out at the end. And then it becomes something entirely different. But yeah, in terms of how to keep it in the style of what you're composing and making otherwise, I'm not too sure. I mean, it could be that you're using similar source material,
I see.
to create these sounds. But yeah, that's an interesting thought.
All right. Thank you so much.
Synthesizers are also very useful for creating user interface
Yeah.
sounds.
All right.
Yeah, so what you can do is you can download like a free synth plugin. There are loads of them. Which is the free one everyone uses. Can't remember now. But, some free synth plugin. I'm sure you'll find lots of suggestions on YouTube. If it has a randomize function, that's quite useful. So
All
you
right.
play some notes in it, randomize the patch, gives you entirely new sounds. You record that, and then it's the same process of just harvesting, essentially, little sounds from it. But that would be like an approach that's not. I'm not trying to create a specific sound. I'm just creating all kinds of sounds and see if there's anything useful in it. I think that's quite a
All right.
nice approach. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Lawrence.
Awesome. Can we hear some cool music transitions with markers? No, we can't. I'm
I was
sorry.
going to ask about that. You taught us that in second year. Is that like a video still available to anyone who took the course?
I wondered because
You took
we
us generative
also,
music.
yeah, I'm not sure. It would have been on Classroom somewhere. If it's still available, that would be great because there's also a little UI thing in there, which I might be able to share.
Yeah, you had quite a cool, unique setup for getting UI sound to work with Fmod, because despite Fmod's brilliance, it's like the on-click trigger thing just doesn't work with buttons and that. You have to
Yeah.
like have it as an event and then trigger the script and the Jared, remember the hoops we had to go through
There was a whole
on the
thing.
game?
Yeah. There was a whole thing. I'll go and look for that. Yeah. I literally thought about it like just before this chat. So yeah, and then we can make some nice transitions with markers again. Yeah, but all those things should be recorded. I'll go and look for them. We can do another one of these on music if you want to,
That'd be great.
but maybe
Yes,
specific like
please.
implementation of the music into something like Fmod. Although that's like that topic can take like 3 years. We'll put it into a nice little 2-hour bucket.
Brief.
Yeah. We'll make 2 seconds of music together. Yeah.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah, Reaper did get a little bit of an update, I guess, but it's also I customized how mine looks because that's what Reaper allows you to do.
You can skin it like you can with Visual Studio Code, Jared,
With
with
Winamp.
all the little color schemes and that.
Nice.
Yeah, but there aren't really great skins out there. So actually, I don't know if any of you remember Winamp.
Oh, of course. Winamp.
It's the guy who made Winamp that makes Reaper. If you didn't
Uh-huh.
know that, yeah.
I think Winamp was before these students' time.
Most likely. Most likely. Oh damn, I lost my Discord window. There we go. I'm playing with a makeup brush, in case you're curious. I use it to dust my equipment with. Anyway. Yeah, like all the knobs and stuff. Mixer, interface, all of those things.
Mixer.
Yeah. Yeah, little desk mixer here.
Oh, nice. So I had it in my head. This is the dead streaming platform Mixer. So I was like, what? But yeah, I understand now. I was just being dumb.
And the keyboards and those kinds of things. They get so dusty here in the cave.
I hate
No.
dust, honestly. You gotta like, you don't vacuum for like 5 days. And I was like, okay, cool. Well, everything's got to be degreased now or dedusted and go through like 4 cans of Mr. Min a month.
Well done that you actually do that. I just, if it gets too dusty, I just don't come here anymore, and then get the courage to clean up one day, and then I can be productive again.
I thought you would abandon the studio and just create another one.
I do sometimes. Yeah. If it
So like,
gets
how
too
many
much.
studios have you left behind? Have like 15 empty rooms just all building up with dust.
Go digs another hole in a mountain and moves all of his stuff in there.
Yeah. All right. I think that's me, and that's you. So thanks for
Awesome.
joining
Thank
me.
you so much. That was great.
So much,
Thank you so much, Louwrens.